cancels out the sound for sure.
Typically,
If you want to give it a shot, yeah, sure, thank you.
speak completely extemporaneously, and yet I have prepared a talk today, which I will refer to quite a bit, but I reserve the right to go completely off it.
Yes. I celebrate that right.
And also, I would like to also say what a pleasure it is to be here, and how I find the very conference itself to be expressing itself in diaphanous expression, of which I am pleased to be part. I'm going to write a couple of terms immediately on the board. I'm not starting my timer yet. These are some basic terms that I'm going to be using, and I'll quickly explain what they are. Huangdi Neijing is the name of is comprised of two texts. The Su Wen, simple questions, and the Ling Shu, the spiritual pivot. This is the fundamental core text of Chinese medicine. As it happens, just in the last couple of weeks, my entire worldview has been completely demolished. I happened to read this thing that said there's no such thing as Han Dynasty medicine, there's only Tang Dynasty medicine. Insofar as this is a received text that was redacted in the Tang Dynasty. And in fact, some of the chapters of it that I will refer to were actually the work of a single person who added these chapters. It comprises one of the largest sections of this text. And that was added in the Tang Dynasty. And what's interesting about the Tang Dynasty, of course, is that it was the primary, greatest flourishing of Chinese poetry, for one thing. It was a time when Buddhism was ascendant and Taoism was also supported by the state. So it was a very rich cultural time in China. It's also the time when it also happens to be the time when esoteric Buddhism was flourishing in China. So the Tantric, East Asian Tantric Buddhism. All of which came to influence, to some degree, the additions that were made to this text in the Tang Dynasty. The other text that I'll be referring to is called the Shang. This is a text, an herbal formula text. And this stems from the Warring States period, which is actually pre-Han. And this text is organized. This means attack by cold. Treatise. This is a book of Chinese herbal formulas. I would also like to add that creating herbal formulas in the Chinese method is poetry. And poetry as world-making reality, which is what I'm describing. This is based on a model derived from chapter 6 and 66 through 72 of this book. And I'll go into this in detail because this is the crux of the matter. One of the ways that I illustrate this is as a circle with a line through it. But I need you to project that out towards infinity in all directions and recognize that it's a sphere. Okay? It's a sphere. And within that sphere, the human stands in a field comprised of that sphere. The human body is made up of the aspects of that sphere. Every human form, aspect of human form, and every aspect of human function is infused with some aspect of movement within that sphere that is comprised of time, space, direction, rhythm. But because it would take me a while to kind of like shade it in to make it a sphere, I'll just tell you as we go through, I'll show you how it is that this sphere manifests on the human body. And you will imagine that when I make this shape, right, when I make this gesture, that's the gesture of coming up from the back of that sphere in the yang realm, right? So the back of my body, if I was an animal, I'm on all fours. The sunlight, Taiyang, which is called, the sun is called Taiyang, great yang. The Taiyang would necessarily be on my back. And my paws will be warm. I can go through the snow, but my face will be cool because I can look around. Okay. So, this is the realm of yang, and this is the realm of yin. And this is the dividing point wherein yin and yang, forming one whole, turn the one into the other. This is the unseen and dark realm, and this is the light and manifest realm. So, in Chinese medicine, as I was saying, the anatomical position is like this. And we don't, it says the sage faces south. So that means that when I'm facing south, I'm facing towards the sun. And my hands are like this. The number Chinese, or the number 6 in Chinese is written like this, right? A representation of a human being who's breathing from his heels and taking in the influences of the earth, and who's completely open to the sun and is able to take in the influence of the sun. And when those two things meet, when yang and yin meet, it is said yang and yin grind together, and what they produce is Shang, spirit. So we'll start there, and I'll fill this in. And I'm going to start my timer now. So, to some extent, we can, well, maybe in the interest of time we can not do this, but if it's really absolutely necessary and I say something that you completely don't understand, just raise a hand and ask me right away. All right. The other thing is I did a little quick bibliomancy before the talk, and it refers to something we were talking about earlier, actually. The essence of the arcane, the occult, is its spaceless, timeless concealment. This is page 449. It can never be made visible, yet it could become transparent if we would perceive such phenomena irrationally and not approach them rationally, or permit them to mislead us irrationally, or allow them to overpower us pre-rationally. Now, on that note, I also want to say, everything that I say, some of the things that I'm going to say may seem unusual or hard to believe, but everything I say, everything I'm going to say is true. And I've experienced it. So, there's one other thing, which is that, speaking of being with the dead, in preparation for this talk, I decided to have a chat with Gebser. And he told me that the key to my talk was the creativity. The chapter, especially the chapter on creativity. And then he said something which I haven't been able to find in the text, which is intention is not causality. We'll get to that. I like to and it's funny because I like to paraphrase the Situationist International and say, instead of demand the impossible, that we should intend the impossible. Okay, timer. Here we go. Perhaps the most oft-repeated tale from one of China's greatest literary and religious texts is a brief passage wherein once Zhuangzhou dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable, Zhuangzhou. But he didn't know if he were Zhuangzhou who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzhou. Between Zhuangzhou and a butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. Zhuangzhou is the purported author of the text that is called the Zhuangzi. And you know it is like a considered a companion to the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, which is also known as the Lao Tzu. Zhuangzi is actually far superior to the Tao Te Ching. It's the most important, it's where the heels story comes from. And it's also a remarkably delightful piece of work. In my practice of Chinese medicine, I've had many such experiences, not the least of which was in a lightning-like flash finding my own experience of the transformation of things reflected back to me in the work of Gebser. And indeed, finding Gebser's own experience very reminiscent of my own. So in speaking to you today about Chinese medicine, I've pondered this question. Am I trying to show the aperspectival aspects already nascently present within Chinese medicine? Or am I trying to explain how Chinese medicine concepts can be transformed when looking through an aperspectival lens? Both. The answer lies in the how of my approach. I practice a system of pulse diagnosis which has been handed down for many generations in a very strict master-to-disciple pattern. My own teacher has found a way to democratize that. But this is a style that is called Shang hammer pulse diagnosis. And it's the crux of my work. And I'll get into it a little bit, but if you can ask me about it later. So Shang hammer pulse diagnosis is the core of my work. In essence, a method that allows one to perceive all aspects of a human being's physiology in its most immediate and enduring manifestations, from gross physical biomedical processes through the very spiritual expression of the intensification of becoming and the evolution of being. When I say gross physical biomedical processes, I mean I can detect tumors from feeling the wrist, and I can identify where in the lung there's water accumulated, and I can identify where on your head you had head trauma, and I can identify what part of your small intestine is more affected by inflammation, etc. And this is all done through pulse diagnosis accomplished at the radial artery. After feeling thousands of pulses and learning how to listen and relate with all aspects of my being, I sought a treatment model that could reflect the incredible depth and wholeness that I could perceive at my fingertips. And I found this same depth available in the 6 conformations, which is the term that describes all of the relationships that I will describe here, and is what forms the basis for this text, the pattern of organization of this text. These concepts of the 6 conformations are the theoretical template upon which all possible manifestations of change and interaction are predicated, and form the basis for the Shanghan Lun, a text that for the first time provided certain symptoms and pulses leading straight to a diagnosis, which likewise leads to a very specific treatment, the dream of every Chinese medical practitioner. This necessitated further inquiry into the classical texts, which are the foundation upon which the Shang is based. To my delight, I found those fundamental texts to be more inclusive of the entire corpus of the Han Dynasty canon, especially those texts dealing with nature, consciousness, and inner cultivation. And deeper in history, I found echoes of the basic human orientation to reflect a process of identifying with and fostering a relationship to the constant ebb and flow of all phenomena. This is commonly termed animism, but from a Gebzerian perspective can lead to a new mode that he terms syneresis, the four-dimensional diaphony. In this, what is merely conceivable and comprehensible becomes transparent. Diaphony is based on syneresis and the ideological completion of systasis and system to an integral whole. This reminds me of chapter 4 from Zhuangzi. Make your will one. Don't listen with your ears, listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind, listen with your spirit. Listening stops with the ears. The mind stops with recognition. But spirit is empty and waits for all things. The way gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind. But so what of this spirit, or rather, the spiritual? What of this emptiness? I refer you to the previous talk. The phenomenon releasing origin is spiritual. Gebser 542. The phenomenon releasing origin is spiritual, and with each consciousness mutation, it becomes more realizable by man. The shining through, diaphaneity or transparency, is the form of appearance, epiphany, of the spiritual. The emptiness described in this passage is not a void, it is a state of potential and the very ground from which manifestation arises. If I had known you were going to quote Gunther, I would have ripped out all my Gunther quotes. I love Gunther.
Yes, it's wonderful.
I also note the similarity of the passage from Zhuangzi to a passage from the Neijing. This is from Su Wen, chapter 26. The spirit. Ah, the spirit. The ears do not hear it. When the physician's eyes are clear, his heart is open and his mind goes ahead. He alone apprehends it as if it were clearly perceivable. But the mouth cannot speak of it. Everyone looks, but he alone sees. If one approaches it, it seems obscure, but to him alone it is obvious, as if it were clearly displayed, as if the wind had blown away clouds. Hence, one speaks of spirit. There was a time when in a flash, it was as if I suddenly began to perceive in a completely spherical expression the state of every patient in my care. All the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune became palpable. Each patient began to look like a world unto herself, with all of the insults and resources viscerally available to my consciousness. Visually, tactilely, cognitively, presently, I beheld everyone as situated and embodied in a field of vast dimensions in which all things related. Acupuncture points became less textbook locations and became whole worlds of texture and surface imbued with wakeful presence. And this accords with Gebser's definition of consciousness as neither knowledge nor conscience, but in the broadest sense as wakeful presence. Thus, embodied consciousness describes organisms within a relational field, a field not of interconnected points, but of interwoven lines, not a map, but a world. And this recalls Gebser's assertion that the sphere is the expression of the aperspectival world. Aperspectivity is the volition, the awareing in truth of the whole, and consequently of its spiritual manifestation, the diaphanon, inasmuch as the whole is perceptible only as transparency, wherein origin, also containing the entire future, is time-free present. To attain this consciously without abandoning the earlier consciousness structures is to overcome rationality in favor of irrationality and to break forth from mentality into diaphaneity. What followed from these experiences was a new orientation towards time. I had already begun to reframe the concept of qi as the felt sense. And in adopting this simple shift, I experienced the process of needling as a form of making contact with the felt sense that would arise, generating bodily awareness in a new way. As a corollary, I also paid close attention to my own felt sense, and then could perceive in my own body the awareness that the patient also experienced. I was already accustomed to deploying intense concentration in order to feel and differentiate the sensations in the pulse, taking in 28 positions and up to 8 depths on the radial arteries of both wrists. I now feel really infinite depths in the pulse, but my system, the system that I learned, has 8. In order to feel the subtleties of communication that are available to perception, I also had to undergo a shift in my own perception of time, because it's possible to feel pulse qualities that may point to an event that occurred many years previously. It was as if millimeters of space became filled with years of time, and within a single position I could feel as a bare kinesthetic sensation different temporal strata in a patient's life experience. As an example, I once felt a series of sensations as I applied pressure to the wrist using my middle finger on the right-hand side on the radial artery right here. As I applied pressure to the wrist, it immediately informed me of the entire etiology of the onset of juvenile diabetes in this patient 20 years or so prior to his first visit with me. A febrile disease, a near-death experience from drowning at age 3, the death of a grandfather immediately at the time of the patient's birth, and then even deeper, the very effects of the damage to the pancreas that is associated with type 1 diabetes. The sensations that I feel in the pulse will be replicated in the body in the channels that are associated with whatever pulse I'm feeling. In this case, when I found the acupuncture point through palpation, I also felt, so this is the stomach channel, the Yang Ming stomach channel, and so I palpate from the knee down here, and I found that there was a corresponding hard, dry, uneven, rough quality in the tissue right here. So that's where I'll insert the needle. In this case, when I found the acupuncture point through palpation, I also felt similar sensations at the tip of the needle. And I immediately perceived an image of a dense mass of small bulbous capsules, and the words islets of Langerhans came into my mind. After the treatment, I looked up the term islets of Langerhans. I was looking for the image, and of course I found exactly the image that I had seen in my mind's eye. The patient's need for insulin injections began to lessen. The body had literally become transparent, and time itself had expanded and contracted simultaneously in one moment. From that point forward, I began to conceive of many of the basic terms in Chinese medicine as expressions of time intersecting with human physiology. Some human functions are expressions of a diurnal cycle, what is termed the qi of the organs. Some functions are expressions of cycle of human maturation that actually unfold in 7 or 8 year increments. This is what we term essence. Still others move at the rate of 15 inches a second, which is the speed with which blood leaves the heart. Actually. Likewise, many variegated channel systems elaborated by the earliest Chinese medical texts are also expressions of these same time signatures. So the channels, the main channels that are divided in 6 times 2 correspond also to those diurnal cycle functions. While there is a set of channels that are considered to be deeper, it's not a matter of depth. They're considered to be deeper, greater intensification. And these embody the 7 or 8 year cycles by which a person matures and eventually dies, and eventually declines and eventually dies. Yet all of these different channel systems can be employed simultaneously in a total moment that essentially mends or restructures, renders immediately available to perception multiple streams of duration and trails of manifestation. Several fundamental intensifications are necessary to, in verity, perceive in this manner. The first and most pressing in our time is to break through any dualistic, positivist, materialist focus. In Chinese medicine, this means recognizing simultaneously the relationship between form and function in human physiology, to leap beyond pattern recognition and into the observation of relationships of things as they are in any given individual. Unfortunately, the development of Chinese medicine in the modern era has not been free of this materialist, pathology-oriented paradigm. But if we, quote, do not risk upsetting some persons and things and indicate the inadequacy of systems with their categorical rigidities, we will not be able to approach the new world reality. The second factor is to recognize embodied cognition, in which one perceives all of the functions actively constructing the lived experience as nothing other than awareness, or wakeful presence. The principal avenues for this recovery are the felt sense of the body, and regarding every physiological function and every pathological symptom as a message unfolding from, as the ancients would say, heaven. This simple shift accords with Gebser's treatment of creativity as an originary phenomena, and naturally calls to mind the words famously attributed to the Tang Dynasty sage Sun Simiao, "Medicine is change." Or more interpretively, to know medicine is tantamount to knowing I Ching science. You know the I Ching, right? Okay. Gebser, of course, likewise appeals to the I Ching in his discussion of creativity. There's two noteworthy aspects to his assessment. First, Gebser emphasizes the role of the incipient state. He says, "We have quoted these lines since they can suggest to a thoughtful person how important it is to recognize the inceptual or germinal situations." The term that is being translated as inceptual or germinal is ji, which is a term that means incipience, something in an incipient state. In Chinese medicine, this term, ji, is the term for the dynamic with which the energy in your body moves. And it's this dynamic that we must seize upon to rectify, in keeping with the statement that intention is not causality. It's imperative we have to embody a complete empty state in which intention is not some deployment of the will, but is instead a complete rectification of the interaction between the patient and the practitioner. So, Gebser's second astonishing insight is in this chapter devoted to creativity, is his recognition that the very antiquity of the names applied to the trigrams upon which the I Ching is based belong to a deeper and more archaic strata. In fact, in a 2005 paper, a scholar named Julie Li Wei convincingly demonstrates that the names of the trigrams correspond to the oldest forms of Old Semitic and are actually clear cognates of terms from Proto-Indo-European. So one of the trigrams that's a good example is this trigram, which is a hard line with underneath two soft lines, or a yang line underneath two yin lines, which is called Zhen, and it means thunder. And Zhen is not the modern Mandarin word for thunder. Zhen is a unique word meaning thunder applied to this trigram. And this Zhen corresponds to the same root from which thunder comes. And this is true of all of the trigrams. Now the point of this example is that it shows that there's a more archaic oral transmission at play in all of the fundamental texts of Chinese